Hello, everyone. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. Happy 2022. I'm super excited to be with all of you. As you know, I'm recovering from COVID, and I'm really excited to be able to do this live training with all of you. And also, we have a very special guest. We have Christy Jordan-Fenton. Christy, welcome to our community.
Oh, thank you for having me. And yeah, happy 2022. And I'm glad you're recovering, Mona.
I am very happy to. Christy, since we met a couple of years ago at Vital Voices, and you shared this story with me, I was not even living in Canada at the moment, but it was such an inspiring story. I really wanted to invite you to our community. And I'm really delighted that you are here with us today because your story is amazing. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, about your background, and then we can share the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited that you live in Canada now, even though we haven't been able to meet up just yet. So I live in the northern part of British Columbia, the northeastern part. Mona's in the southwestern part, quite a long ways from each other. I'm the author of 4 books. I will be talking to you a little bit about that and that journey. And I do a lot of work in helping people to reframe their stories, not just for business, but to change their lives. If you change your story, you can change your life. So I work in professional training and development, and often with students who they have employment barriers or barriers to starting their business that have to do with trauma. So one thing we do a lot is we work on reframing stories. So I'll be talking to you a lot today about the first time that I ever worked with somebody on reframing a story. But I am coming to you today from the territory of the Daneza. This is the traditional territory of the Daneza. I'll show you on a map in a moment where that's at. And I practice traditional ceremonies with the Kainai Blackfoot of Southern Alberta. And I don't know, when we're ready, I will jump into the storytelling and telling you a bit more about the journey that I had that got me into this line of work.
Let's do that, Christy.
Okay.
And about our Indigenous community, that I believe it's each and every one of us is our responsibility to learn more about it and be able to talk to our kids about it as well. So I'm super excited that we're going to learn about that and also about your books also.
All right. So thank you, Mona. So I worked on 4 children's books with my children's grandmother. So this is the covers of the 4 books. So my children's grandmother, Margaret Olemaun Pokiak-Fenton, she's also behind me here. She grew up in the high Arctic and was Inuvialuk, which is a type of Inuit. And I got really fascinated about her stories. So Margaret was the grandmother of my children, which means I was married to her son at one point, but when I wasn't married anymore, she said, there's no more in-law now, I'm just your mom. So she was my mother-in-law. And here's some pictures that I brought today of Margaret as a very little girl. When she went away to residential school, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. Her at 16 in a semi-modern, semi-traditional outfit, and what she looked like before she passed. She passed just this past April. So I became very interested in Margaret's stories because when I was growing up, I was raised by a Cree stepfather, and he had gone to residential school. It wasn't something he talked about very much. But I thought he was just so interesting. If we went camping, he knew how to build the most amazing bush camps. He made bannock, which is a type of bread, on a stick over a fire. Just a very fascinating person. And I always wanted to know more and connect more. So now Margaret enters my life, and she's Inuvialuk, which is a type of Inuit. The former term that was used was Eskimo, from the very high Western Arctic. So I met Margaret, and I just started asking her questions all the time about what it was like to travel by dog sled, to hunt wolves and polar bears, and grow up under the northern lights and all the really cool things that she did. One of the motivations I had for knowing more was also because she was my children's grandmother. And as I said, we live in the territory of the Inuvialuk, we live in the territory of the Daneza, and she's from the territory of the Inuvialuk. I really wanted my children to understand what it meant to be Inuvialuk and to be very proud of that. So here they're all dressed in traditional dress. My youngest child wasn't born yet, but they all have traditional names, are dressed in traditional dress. So Margaret found this a little bit interesting because none of her children, they grew up as cowboys. She moved south, and so her children grew up as cowboys. And she found it interesting that I wanted to know so much because most of her children they weren't that interested in her growing up in the Arctic. They were just more excited about horses and being cowboys. So I started bugging Margaret all the time to tell me stories. And one day she told me a really different story. She said, we were driving to town. We lived in the country and we were driving to town. And she said, they used to call me Fatty Legs. And I said, oh, really? So she goes on to tell me this story about when she was just 8 years old. She wanted nothing more in the world than to learn how to read. But where she was at in the high Arctic, there was no school. There was no possibility of learning to read. So she begged her parents to go far away to a residential school, meaning it was the type of boarding school. She would have to stay there. Now in Canada, most children who are Indigenous were forced to go to these schools. Margaret's one of the very few people who actually asked to go. So she lived so far away that the government couldn't make her go to the school. So when she got to the school, she got stuck there for 2 years, which when I talk to young people, I always say that's got to be the world's longest school day. And it didn't turn out to be anything like she thought it was going to be. It was actually so horrific that it left her with long-lasting trauma, a very deep trauma. Up until the time she passed, she still occasionally got nightmares. But talking about her story and sharing her story helped her heal from a lot of it. So she told me when she got to the school, one of the worst things that happened was she had a nun who picked on her all the time. And she couldn't do anything right. She was always getting extra chores and a lot of bad stuff happened. But one of the things was that this nun gave her these bright red stockings. And so they made her legs look big and everybody teased her and they called her Fatty Legs. Now you can imagine in a school where you're wearing uniforms, if you're wearing something different, you're going to stand out. She didn't like being called Fatty Legs. So she came up with this very clever way to get rid of her stockings. And she kept that secret for 65 years. I was actually the first person to find out what she did with her stockings. So of course, when the stockings went missing, they tore apart the whole school. They tore apart the dormitory. They never found the stockings. She made sure she got rid of them. When I heard Margaret's story, I got really excited. I said, you've got to let me write the story. It was just, I just knew it was something. And she said, no. And I was devastated. I was like, what do you mean I can't write your story? This is an amazing story. What you did was so fantastic. And she said no, because she thought what she did was really naughty and she didn't want her grandchildren to know that she was very naughty in getting rid of her stockings. She didn't think it was a story to celebrate. The reason she finally gave in and said that I could share her story was because she didn't think anybody was going to care about it. Who was going to care about this young Inuvialuk girl who went to a school? Her story takes place at in the 1940s. So the same time as World War II. So she thought nobody's going to care at all about this. No publisher's going to publish it. Nobody's going to buy it. So now we're actually, this is the 10th anniversary edition that was released, but we're at our 12-year anniversary. It was published in 2010, and Fatty Legs has been made part of curriculums all across Canada. I've heard from a few teachers in the States that are studying it, and I frequently am contacted by teachers from international schools, which is really exciting. Her story even ended up being translated into Hangul, and a lot of international students in South Korea use her story both in English and in Hangul. It's very exciting to me because I really believed people were going to care about her story and see her the way I saw her, and it turned out to be true, that they did care. So I'm going to try and show you on a map here.
Christy, sorry, before we continue, are you going to tell us how she got rid of the socks, or we have to buy the book?
a lot of times I don't tell, but I do have it. When we get to the end, I'll let you know. So
okay, but I thought it would be nice if you ask everyone to buy the books. That's how they're going to find out, because that would be a good incentive as well.
Well, that's usually what I do. So I'm going to show you now where I'm at today. I can show you where Mona's at if you're not that sure, and also where Margaret comes from and went to school. So if you look where the star is, that's roughly where Vancouver is. It doesn't look like that big of a distance from where I'm at, but with the weather the way it is, and Vancouver got a lot of snow, it's probably going to take you 18 to 20 hours or more to get to where I'm at. In the summertime, it's 14 to 16 hours. And so for those of you who might know another city, Edmonton, about 7 hours northwest of Edmonton. So where the house is, that's where I'm at, and it's the traditional territory of the Daneza. Now, if you were going to go to where Margaret is from, you would drive for 3.5 days without sleep. It's a gorgeous drive, but it's a long drive, almost until you got to the ocean. And that would be Inuvik. I don't have Inuvik marked on the map, but just drive straight to the ocean, pretty much, and you're near Inuvik. From there, you would get on a plane for 2.5 hours to end up where the Mittens are, which is Banks Island. That's where Margaret comes from. And when we used to talk to young people, we would always say, if she was living any further north, she would have been living with Santa Claus. It's very, very north. Now, to go to school, she had to cross the Arctic Ocean and come up the river to where the books are. That's a Aklavik. It doesn't look like a huge distance, but that trip would take well over a week. It was a really, really far distance to go. And you can see why she couldn't just run away from school and go home. There was no way to get across that ocean and make it back home. And let's see if I can get to the next one. There we go. So this is what it looks like where Margaret is from. This is Banks Island. There are no trees, so it is far enough north that trees don't grow there. The odd little shrub, but mostly nothing like taller than your ankle grows there. And in front, that's the ocean. Now, the ocean would freeze for 10 months of the year. It doesn't as much anymore. I've seen some of my relatives up north complaining recently about how soon the ice leaves from the island. But it used to freeze for 10 months of the year. Once it froze, that was it. They were landlocked. They didn't have planes just coming in and out you could hop on, or any other way off the island other than by a boat. Most of the buildings that you see in this picture aren't actually houses. They are frame tents. So Margaret's people, she grew up living in a tent, and that's because her people were semi-nomadic. So every once in a while, they would pick up everything and they would move somewhere else for better hunting, fishing, trapping. They moved all around the island, and they even moved from this island to different areas. And I'll just show you here. So this is what a frame tent looks like to stay warm. Even where the ocean freezes, you can stay warm in these tents. They would put snow and ice around the outside for insulation, and they would have a stove inside. And they actually had a full frame bed that her parents would set up in there, just almost like a modern home. The way she describes it reminds me a bit when you see people who still live in yurts and you go inside, it looks like a living room. So they had all the modern conveniences. Her father did very well as a trapper, but they lived in a tent. And here, the largest child in the middle, that's Margaret. She thinks she was 10 or 11 here, she wasn't entirely sure. And she's wearing a traditional parka. It's sometimes called a Mother Hubbard parka. Its proper name is an etikluk. And underneath that, they would have a heavy layer of caribou fur. And a caribou is basically a wild reindeer. Their fur is unbelievable. I don't think that they have discovered a synthetic that is as warm as the caribou fur. So they'd have a heavy layer of caribou fur underneath, and you could stay quite warm. So this is a place where the ocean freezes. This is the middle of winter. You can see all the snow everywhere, and the kids are outside and they're not bothered by it at all. They would wear the outer layer of that parka in the summertime without the fur underneath, and keep the hood up because it would keep away the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes up north are really, really bad. So when she went to school, they got dressed like this. And even with the snow that's happened in Vancouver lately, I don't think anybody's would want to go dress their kids to go to school like this in the winter, let alone where the ocean freezes. Now, when the Europeans came, they were outsiders. And the way that I explain it to people is, so Margaret's people, she had all this ancestral knowledge, all the knowledge of the grandparents, the great-grandparents, the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, all this ancestral knowledge to know how to live exactly where they were at. Each set of grandparents came up with a better and better idea. But when she went to school, the outsiders, they were really new to the territory. And for some reason, they thought that things should be done like they were in Paris or they were in London, but they weren't. They were where the ocean freezes. What this did to the children was it made them grow up to always second guess themselves. One of the most important things that you have is your own common sense or your own knowledge of what's practical. And when you're told, no, what you think is right, that's not right. So Margaret sometimes she was a very strong woman, but sometimes she would question the most common things. And it dated back to residential school, being told that, no, dressing nice and warm isn't the way to do it. Let's dress so that we're all going to get frostbite. And here's just a picture of her parents dressed really nice and warm. Back in the day when they didn't have elastic, her father would just tie a sash around his waist, and that would keep the wind from coming up underneath his parka. And her little brother has his mittens on a string down in the bottom corner. And very practical, because in the north, if you might have to take your mitts off to tie up your dog sled or put a hook on a fishing line. Nowadays, it would be maybe to fix your snowmobile. But the snow can move in so quickly that your mitts can be covered instantly. And a lot of the time in the winter, it's dark. So you want to always have your mitts with you. If you take them off, you can't set them down. You've got to have them on you at all times. So it was really, really practical. They had very clever ways of living in the north. When she went to school, this is what it looked like where she went to school. This building, though, is actually the hospital. And next to the hospital, they had the school. Now, when we talk about residential schools, what people often don't understand about the schools is they weren't sending the kids to go and get a better education. I know many people have sent their children to boarding school to give them better opportunities, and so they can go on to be doctors or lawyers and whatever they dream to be. But residential schools were teaching children to do jobs nobody else wanted to do. So when the settlers came here, they looked around and they saw the land they wanted to, log it, mine it, farm it, put cities on it. And Indigenous people were living really, really well off the land. They had no need to leave. Even young children from a very early age had all kinds of responsibilities and all kinds of skills. So they said, well, how are we going to get people off the land without outright going to war? And they decided that they would send the children to school so they wouldn't learn the skills they needed to live off the land. So what were they going to do with all these kids now that they couldn't live off the land? And they decided they would teach them to do jobs nobody else wanted to do. So in a lot of cases, that was working in factories, sweatshops. The girls were trained to keep house for settlers, and they were also trained. They were trained to keep house for settlers, and they were trained to be basically child brides. So Margaret School, you would graduate at 14. And when you did, then they would, if your parents didn't come get you right away, they were trying to marry you off to the European men who were sometimes 3-4 times older than the girls. So at her school, they taught them also to work in the hospital, but doing the jobs nobody wanted to do. So that was emptying the bedpans, that was serving the meals, cleaning up sick patients. And when she was at the school, they actually had an outbreak. They had several outbreaks, but they had an outbreak of disease when she was there. And they made the little girls go and work in the hospital, exposing them to that. Now, behind this picture, you can just barely see trees. They're really scruffy, old kind of little trees. They're like Charlie Brown Christmas trees. And where Margaret went to school was just far enough south, trees start to grow. Not big trees, but she was terrified of trees, absolutely terrified. And that's because she didn't grow up with trees. So their big event was that they would go berry picking. It was like their big field trip. And it would be so exciting because at the schools, they were never fed enough to eat. So they were always hungry. So if you went berry picking, you're trying to shove all the berries in your mouth you could. But Margaret was just absolutely terrified of the trees, having not grown up with them. Now, the teachers made it worse because they would tell the children stories of children who went missing in the woods and monsters waiting to get them. I have one friend who went to a different residential school, and they told the girls if they went near the woods, they were going to get pregnant, and they didn't have any sex education, so they were quite worried that that was going to happen. I think probably they told the children things like this so they wouldn't run away. Now, at the school, Margaret had one teacher that she really liked. The tallest nun in the middle was Sister McQuillan. And she was a teacher who actually cared about the kids, and Margaret got along really well with. And Margaret used to always tell this funny story about Sister McQuillan and trees. So in the time Margaret was growing up, of course, there's no internet. She had very, very little access to books, almost no knowledge of the outside world. She knew everything there was to know about where she lived and had all kinds of skills for that, but didn't know about the outside world. So she gets to school and they start learning A is for apple, like many people do. And she didn't really know what an apple was, but it looked juicy and she knew you could eat it. And Sister McQuillan said to her, Margaret, do you know where apples come from? And Margaret said, no, I don't know. And she said, well, they grow on trees. And Margaret thought that she was teasing her, because how could an apple grow from these like wiry, bristly Christmas trees? She just couldn't understand how that would happen. Of course, she believed Sister McQuillan, though, because she really liked her. So residential schools started a long, long time ago. I always tell kids it's like the time of our great grandparents, but in the 1880s is when residential schools started. We tend to think of this as being a long ago Canadian or American. The US also had these schools. Thing that it happened so long ago in its ancient history, but actually it didn't end until a year after I graduated high school. And so just to put it in perspective, the things that were going on when people were still in residential school was the first Toy Story movie was coming out. People watched The Fresh Prince. They gamed on the Nintendo, listened to the Spice Girls. I've actually met a woman who is much younger than me who went to residential school. Now, when Margaret was going to go to school, she got to go back to school shopping, just like most children do. You take them, you get them some shoes and some pens and pencils and all the things, a new backpack. So she went to the Hudson's Bay Company, really different than we would think of the Bay now. It was a fur trading post where they would have all sorts of supplies, and her mom took her around and they picked out all the things she'd need. So she got her a toothbrush and toothpaste. Now, Margaret's people did take care of their oral hygiene. They did clean their teeth, but they didn't do it with the toothbrush and toothpaste. They had a different method. So she got that, and she got some gray stockings to wear with her school uniform. She was super excited. She said they just were going to make her look so grown up, really, really excited. And of course, when she got to the school, she wasn't allowed to wear those stockings, which was really crushing. So anyway, she goes and she gets all the things. She gets to her first day of school, the first morning. They wake all the girls up and they get them to start cleaning. Now, Margaret can't understand English. And if you've ever had a situation where you've been somewhere where you didn't understand the language, you sort of pick up cues, you start mimicking what everybody else is doing, and you hope you're doing the right thing. So everybody got out their toothbrushes and their tubes of paste, and Margaret did the same. And she put it on her toothbrush and she stuck it in her mouth. And she said it tasted horrible. Her mom had not gotten her toothpaste. Her mom accidentally got her shaving cream. So she said it was the worst thing she'd ever tasted. She couldn't believe, like, what's wrong with these white people? Why are they brushing their teeth like this? And then it got explained to her that it was shaving cream. That actually it's a funny story, but it made her feel really ashamed about her mom. And I always think, why should her mom have been able to read or understand English? She was an Inuvialuk woman who spoke Inuvialukton and lived in the territory of the Inuvialuit. So she was speaking the same language that had been spoken there for 10,000 years. She should have been able to do business in her language. A lot of people will wonder how it is that Margaret's parents, that they let her go to residential school. But imagine now if her mom was trying to get medicine for her and wasn't able to communicate properly. So her father recognized that his children were going to have to be able to read and understand English if they were going to be able to survive because of all the people moving into the north. Something similar that happened during the occupation of South Korea by Japan is some of the wealthy families sent their sons over to Japan to go to school so that they could learn to do business, Japanese style and customs and make relations. And so this wasn't really that different. When she got to the schools, the worst teacher she had, we called her the Raven. Margaret chose not to use her name in the book. She didn't want to use her name because she didn't want the story to be about that woman. It was more about how Margaret survived what happened at the school. Now, we called her the Raven only because of how she looked in her habit, dressed up in all of her nun's clothes. But ravens actually for many Indigenous nations, they're all different. They all have different beliefs, but ravens mostly are considered to be very, very good animals. They're sacred animals. The territory where Mona lives, the Indigenous cultures, they all believe that the raven is part of their creation story. And it's a beautiful creation story. If you look online, just Google Raven steals the light, and you'll find all kinds of stories about it. So just to say, this isn't a cultural thing. We did call a lot of the characters in Fatty Legs by animals because children tend to associate people that they know or give nicknames based on what they know. So Margaret didn't have TV, she didn't have books, but she did study wildlife a lot. And so that's where we came up with using animals. So she gets to school and her teacher is a complete bully. And usually when we have bullies in our lives, they're, when we're younger, they're about our age, maybe a little older. They're not usually the adults in our lives. But in this case, it was a grown woman. A lot of people wonder how this was not uncommon. And a lot of people wonder how such horrible people ended up in the schools. There's a lot of different reasons. So one is that, especially so in Canada, the French Canadian families, especially, but it happened across Canada, who were Catholic. If they had a lot of children, well, they tended to have a lot of children, and it was a real honor to have one of the children either become a priest or a nun. And so sometimes they forced, from a young age, they would force girls to go off to the convent and become a nun. It wasn't what they wanted to do. And of course, back in the day, for a woman to get an education was really difficult. If you wanted to be a career woman and you didn't want to have kids, but you wanted access to lots of knowledge and advancing yourself, one of the options you had was to become a nun. Then you could basically do university as a woman and not have to have money to do that. Now imagine you're sent to the middle of nowhere to look after kids. You might not be the best person to be looking after those children. The other thing that happened with the priests and the nuns is that if they got in trouble in a settler community for harming children or being inappropriate or being abusive in a school, they couldn't really just kick them out of the church, or they could have, I guess, but they didn't. They didn't kick them out. They sent them to places where there were no parents to complain about how the children were being treated. So the residential schools basically ended up being dumping grounds for problem nuns and priests. And of course, people who wanted to have access to do horrible things to children and not have people watching over their shoulder, they purposely tried to get into residential schools. So a whole lot of things going on there about why it got bad. So Margaret got dropped off her first day of school, and a whole lot of changes happened. One of the things that they did was take away her name. So when she was born, Margaret's name that she was given was Olemaun, and I'll talk to you in just a second about what that name means. She wasn't allowed to have her name registered that way. So when her father went to register her birth, he had to use a Christian name. And it's actually very recently that in Canada that you're allowed to use traditional names on a birth certificate, like a couple of years ago, recent. So on her birth certificate, it said Margaret, but that wasn't the name that she went by. And this is really common that when children went to school, they weren't allowed to use their traditional name. So her name, Olemaun, means, so there's a picture of an ulu knife. It's a rocker-shaped knife that Inuit women use. And they use this for things like cutting up whale meat and preparing food, even for preparing hides. And Olemaun is the stone that you would sharpen that knife with. So what Margaret's name meant is that she's strong, determined, couldn't be worn down, maybe a little bit stubborn. So that's what her name meant. In a traditional way, the name that you would be given would tell people and tell you about what's strongest in your spirit. So having a traditional name is a little bit like having a resume. When you tell people your traditional name, they will associate it with other people who've had that name, and they'll know you have the same characteristics. That will tell them a lot about who you are, personality-wise, spirit-wise. And the children who went to the schools, they had no contact with home. So they couldn't call up their parents and be like, come and get me. They couldn't leave the schools. They had no way of getting help. And there was nobody that they could report the abuse to. So all they could do was stay really, really clever and be really strong in their spirits and their hearts. Children coming from a traditional background knew how to do all kinds of jobs. They were really smart. They could go out on the land hunting by themselves. They could, prepare meals out of, when game and berries and things were scarce, they could still figure out how to make a meal out of things. So they were quite smart. And then also they were raised to have these strong spirits. So that's how the children survived through the residential schools. And Margaret was no different. She wasn't allowed to use her name Olemaun, but she frequently reminded herself, my name is Olemaun, I can't be worn down. So the other illustration here shows one time when she was taken to the radio station. This was how she was going to be able to send a message home. She had had no contact with her family for I think a year and a half at this point. They take her to the radio station. She's going to be able to send out a message home. But they told those children what they could say. So they're supposed to say, dear mom and dad, I'm having a great time. School's wonderful. And they really monitored this. The consequences of not doing that would have been really bad. So Margaret thought, I'm not saying what they want me to say. So instead, she stood in front of the microphone and refused to say anything. And she said, her mom said later, all she could hear was just her little girl breathing into the microphone. So even where there was no choice, she still found a way to make a choice. She was not going to lie and say the school was great. So instead, she said nothing at all. Another thing that happened at the schools is they cut off all the girls' hair. Some of you may also have hair teachings. I've been given many hair teachings from around the world. This was a really bad thing to do for most Indigenous people. And again, they all have different teachings. The length of your hair has to do with your courage, your honor, your strength, your connection to spirit, a really big one. So for many people, hair symbolizes a connection to the ancestors. And Indigenous people in Canada are no different in that regard. So they cut off the hair. And that's something that you would only do if you were making a major life change. So you're leaving behind your whole life before, or you cut your hair if somebody close to you died. The other thing they would do is they would take away all their traditional clothing, and they would either throw it out or they would burn it. Now, burning clothes also has to do, or giving away all your things also has to do with when somebody died for many Indigenous cultures. So if somebody close to you dies, you give away everything and you cut your hair and you start your life new without them, so that you're not trapping their spirit in this world and they can move on. So these children go to school now. They can't understand English. They, for the most part, they are in a situation where it's there's real power dynamics. They can't ask questions. For a lot of these children, what they knew is having your hair cut and having your things taken away and burned means somebody died. It wouldn't be until later that night that they could ask questions and find out everybody was okay, but they had still gone through the ceremony of completely severing themselves from their past life. So it was really, really devastating when this was done. There were some other reasons that they cut the hair. One of them was to make everybody look the same. Here, all these girls look like clones. Liz Amini Holmes, who illustrated Fatty Legs, she said the reason she did the cover, not showing the tops of the girls' heads, is because she wanted to show who these girls were, what their hopes, what their dreams were at the school. It didn't matter. They wanted good little wives, good little housekeepers, girls to work in the hospital, changing the sheets. They didn't want these girls to have any sense of who they were or their individuality. Another reason is that when the settlers came, they considered Indigenous people to be quite dirty, but we know from both written and oral history that the Indigenous people here actually felt like the settlers were really, really dirty, especially the Puritans. The Puritans sometimes bathed like once or twice a year, But Indigenous people very much like Muslims, that being clean and cleansing is a part of spiritual practice. So for most Indigenous cultures, in one way or another, they were cleansing themselves daily. And because hair was a spiritual practice, they were very careful about how they kept their hair. Now you see in these pictures that their hair is long, in most cases free flowing. There's not a strand out of place. This represents a number of different Indigenous cultures from across North America. Hair is a spiritual practice. Now, if you look at Europeans at the same time, you'll see people wearing a lot of wigs or having their hair up and tight. Lice was a big thing, a big problem in European cities, especially after the Industrial Revolution. But Indigenous people had a different relationship with the land because they're nomadic. If they're making the land sick, they moved on. If their communities got too big, they split them. And as I said, very fanatical about how clean that they kept their hair. One of the methods of keeping clean, it's still used today, is smudging. So smudging is burning different herbs. There are different herbs that have different meanings and purposes behind them. Here shown as sage. So smudging is a bath for your spirit, but also when you're smudging, and you do this when you gather with people, you do this at different times throughout ceremony. You do this a lot of times. If you were going to enter a teepee or a sweat lodge, you smudge before you go in. So you would, the way that you smudge is you do your hands, you do your face, you do your whole body. Many of the things that are used for smudge, and this is around the world, a lot of people burn incense to purify the air, but they're actually antibacterial. So it's like using hand sanitizer or air disinfectant. So the things that get burned for smudge are also used for cleansing. So before you pray, you smudge. Before you gather with people, you smudge a lot. If you go to ceremonies and gather with people, you will smudge many, many, many times. So to get to the school, Margaret's family used this boat. This boat is called the North Star. And if you are joining us from Vancouver, this boat is docked at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. The man, Bruce, who owns it, he still sails this boat, but he keeps it in the harbor at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. And he would love to tell you all about this boat. He's actually a historian of this boat and has written a few books about it and the other boats that traveled with it. So Margaret's people, they had, I believe it was 4 boats. And they would pack on 6 or 7 families. These were large families. Margaret had 14 siblings. She said they didn't come all at once and they didn't all travel on this boat, but they have large families, their dogs. There is a boat in the Vancouver Maritime Museum, the St. Roch, that actually passed through the north when Margaret was a young girl. And you can see how they'd have these boats set up. They actually have a tent, an Inuvialuk tent, like set up on the deck. And so anyways, they would pack these right full, and then they would go on one shopping trip once a year. So I like to tease when I talk a lot to children, and I tease them and ask whose parents have tried to do that at Costco, and a lot of hands go up. But I say, and you know, your mom didn't or your dad didn't succeed. They went back again, didn't they? So think of everything you'd need in a whole year, really crazy. Now, they would do things like, if it was a good year for hunting and trapping and they could trade a lot, they would get their whole butter for the year, and they would get it in barrels with put in a brine, so like a salty kind of water to preserve it. And they would get cornflakes, but they could only have one really small bowl every Sunday. That was it, because they had to make it last. If they didn't get it on this shopping trip, they had to either find it off the land or do without. And I've been on this boat. It's bigger than you would think, but also smaller when you start thinking about all the people that would be on it. At the school, Margaret was made to do a lot of hard chores. That was the main punishment that she had. But in general, you just had to do a lot of chores. So here is a picture of Margaret. She thinks she was probably around 10 or almost 11 here before she went home. So she went to school at 8 and she came home around 10, and she's unloading barge loads of firewood. So what they would do, the way that they kept the schools and the hospital warm was through wood heat. So they would take barges up and down the river and collect wood. And then they would say to the children, okay, 2 weeks, no school, you're just gonna unload firewood. Except they lived at the school. And this is the Arctic. So for those of you who might not be familiar, the Arctic in the winter time is dark almost 24/7. It's dark all the time. And then this would have been in the spring. So it's getting close to the spring equinox. it would be light all the time. So they just got them up, and Margaret said they made them work until they thought their arms were going to fall off and they couldn't work anymore. And some of the children were really little. Now, it seems like it might be a nice alternative to sitting in a desk, getting outside and getting some exercise, but this wood went several rows back and wrapped all the way around. Now you can see the exposed part, that's the school. It was broken into two wings. They had a boys' side and a girls' side. And through traditional teachings, there are generally, genders are a little more fluid, but there are generally what is the women's roles and the women's work and the men's roles and the men's work. And what happened is when they went to the schools, like Margaret had a brother who went later on, she got to see him for a few minutes at Christmas time. So the girls were not interacting with the boys were interacting with the girls, and they grew up in this very strange way that when they came back together again in community, they didn't know how to interact and how to share their roles. And so we call that the hoop was broken. So people will talk about repairing the hoop, and that's repairing the relationship between men and women. And of course, the girls were told, be scared of the boys are going to hurt you. And the boys are told the girls are filthy, they're dirty, stay away from them. And that's had a huge lasting impact with things like domestic violence and divorce rates and all of those things. And here is a picture of the playroom. This is Margaret's younger sisters. And if she was here, she would say, yeah, they didn't have any toys like that when I went there. They didn't have really any toys. They would make dolls out of rags and things, but no toys when she was there. So this floor, they would make the girls scrub it all the time. And then at the end, they would put down wax, and they would give them these big, thick, like men's work socks. And they would slip and slide up and down to polish the floor. And she said that was really fun. They were just sliding up and down like human bumper cars. That was like her favorite thing to do at school, which is really sad when you consider there was no Swiffer wet jet then. She was on her hands and knees and scrubbing. So at her school, they did not do schoolwork very much in a day, only a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours, 4 hours would be a lot of school, but they lived there. And they didn't have parents there. It was cold outside. There were polar bears, grizzly bears outside. They couldn't go outside and just play in the winter time. So this is how they kept them busy. They had them doing chores and chores and chores. Now, I find with most people who went to residential school, they either are just intensely insane about cleaning. They just have to clean everything. Margaret was always slathering my kids when they were really little, just slathering them in hand sanitizer. I was like, please stop, you're going to kill them. Or I've met people who just the smell of any cleaning products will make them violently ill. And that's because it's tied in with bad memories at the residential school. The boys, they would take right out of class and they would send them to go work trap lines. So they would go, and working trap lines can be pretty dangerous, and it's really hard. You're like out there on the land. I really admire people who work trap lines. That these little boys do it. And the main thing that they would be trapping for is muskrats. So they would get the muskrat and they would bring it back, and then the school would sell the furs to make money for the school, and they would keep the meat and they would feed the children the meat. Now, for some people, this is a traditional food. Some like the Delta Inuvialuk, Margaret's not Delta Inuvialuk, she's high Arctic. Some Anishinaabe peoples, some Northern Cree would eat this, but not Margaret's people. They did not eat furry little creatures. They ate whales, fish, caribou, muskox. And the idea of eating this was just repulsive to Margaret. She hated it. When she finally got to go home, they told her to get on this boat. So this is what we call the school bus. It didn't get you in the morning and take you back at the end of the day. It got you at the end of summer, and you didn't go back again until the beginning of summer. Her parents had relocated to Tuktoyaktuk, which is a little bit closer. It was up the river, still about a week's journey by the time they dropped all the kids off. But it was up the river. Her parents met her, sent word that they were going to meet her there and she was to come home. So her first year, she got stuck at school after that first year because her parents lived too far away and they weren't able, the ice didn't thaw long enough for them to come and get her. So this time she's finally getting to go home. Super excited, and she gets on the boat and it's a long journey. She said they were cramped. Little kids, they had to go to the bathroom. They weren't stopping to let them go very often. She said it was just miserable. And on the boat was this really mean brother. So the brother he's like one of the helpers at the school. Now, when she was working back, if we go back to when there was a pandemic at her school, and she's working around the clock, and she's a little kid, she has to go to the bathroom really bad. And every time she goes to run away to get to the bathroom, none or somebody will stop her, and they send her back, and they make her keep working, and she can just barely hold on. So she finally gets free, and she runs for the bathroom, and this guy gets down in front of her. I guess he used to like to scare the kids a lot. He thought it was funny. He gets right down in front of her, and he just growls at her, and she had an accident. She peed herself. Now, we would hope that our children's teachers, that they would be like trying to get the kid cleaned up and hide it and not let anybody know, but not Margaret's teachers. Margaret's teachers made her wash her underwear on the front lawn and lay it out to dry on the front lawn. So old enough to be looking after patients who are like on their deathbeds, but still having to wash her dirty underwear and put it out on the lawn. So she really didn't like this guy. She held a grudge against this guy. So she gets on the boat. He's on the boat. She's not happy about that. But then one day they stop along the shore. It was kind of a marshy area. And the cook that was with them said, why don't you girls go and look for some duck eggs? If you find duck eggs, I'll make you pancakes. So Margaret and her friend Agnes, they hop off the boat. They're running around in the marshes and the bush. And all of a sudden, Margaret said they came across this big white butt. It was the brother was going to the bathroom in the bushes, and her and Agnes started giggling, and they were giggling so loud the other kids heard, and they all came and ran over and embarrassed this guy. So I don't know if that was karma or not, but you should be careful how you treat people because you never know. So finally, the boat comes to Tuktoyaktuk. This is after a week. And if you've ever gone on a car ride with children, even an hour, you know, they're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? This is like a week. So the boat comes to the shore. It's just touching the shore. It's not anchored. They haven't put out the gangplank, nothing. She just jumps off that boat and starts running for her mom. She sees her mom and she runs up to her, and her mom looks her up and down and shakes her head and says, and her mom barely spoke English, said, no, my girl, no, my girl. She thought, she was panicking because she thought that they brought her back the wrong child. Not because Margaret's mom was a bad person. Margaret was now as tall as her mom. She had been starved for 2 years, so she was super skinny. There was no baby fat left. Her hair had been chopped off. And I think probably the biggest difference was how much trauma would have shown on her face, how devastated she would be. So Margaret was like, oh no, they're going to send me back to the school. So she's looking out to the ocean. She's like, I wonder if I could just run and jump into the ocean. She's trying to figure out how she's going to get away. But luckily, her father recognized her. So he came up and he wrapped his arms around her, and her father had gone to a residential school. He already knew what to expect, what his daughter would look like when she came back. Then her mom felt terrible, also joined her. She had younger brothers and sisters. Some of them didn't really remember her, and what they did remember of her, she was much younger, so she was completely disconnected from her family. Her mom didn't speak English. And over the time that she was at the residential school, she lost her ability to speak Inuvialuk. So that meant in the beginning, her and her mother couldn't speak. She said it took about 6 months to get back in the groove of her own language. At the schools, they did not let them speak their language. And that purpose was, they went back to their communities. They couldn't talk to their grandparents. They couldn't talk to their parents. They couldn't fit into community. So she had to relearn her language, even her favorite foods. So Margaret's favorite foods were muktuk, which is made from the whale blubber and the skin. Pipsi, which is like a dried smoked fish that can be really salty. What else did she? They call it ice cream, but it's actually whipped caribou fat with bits of meat in it. Tastes way better than it sounds. But all of the foods that she grew up eating are very, very rich and fatty, or they're fishy, or they're really salty, very strong taste. At the schools, she lived off of really bland oatmeal. So she lost her ability to handle strong taste. So when she finally got to have all her favorite foods, they made her sick. But Margaret did get back to eating her favorite foods, and she relearned her language. One thing she always taught people was Hana Witpit, and it means how are you? She worked so hard on reclaiming her culture and catching up that her first year home, she got her own dog sledding team, which is like getting half a dozen dogs for Christmas, but it's also getting the keys to the car. This was their main mode of transportation, getting around the village. So you were pretty grown up if you had your own dog sledding team. I love this photo because it shows Margaret learning to walk with a foot in both worlds. And probably a lot of you also have this where you have your traditional culture, but then you're trying to fit in with what's mainstream culture. So this would have been a pretty modern outfit in some ways for the early 1950s, but also there's a lot of beadwork, embroidery, fur. It's also very traditional in a lot of ways. And Margaret was always like that, walking with a foot in both worlds. She would make herself these beautiful winter jackets that were kind of like parkas, but kind of like modern winter jackets. She was always mixing things. So after we talked about Margaret's journey and explored Margaret's journey at school, she realized that was just part of the story. The real tough part was when she came home. So we wrote A Stranger at Home, which explored when she went home and had to fit back in with her family and relearn the language and what that felt like. Then we went back and she still had so many more stories. We did When I Was 8, which takes place at the same time as Fatty Legs, but it's a picture book and has some different stories in it. And we did the same thing for Stranger at Home, did Not My Girl. Now, for Margaret, I find it really funny that first she didn't want anybody to know her story. Then she only gave in to me writing it because she thought nobody was going to care. And it ended up meeting the 10th anniversary. So if Margaret was here, one thing she would tell you is we all have things that we feel ashamed about and traumas that we just want to close the door on and forget about. And she said, when you had the courage to claim your own story, you get to become the hero of your story. And that was what Margaret and I mostly worked on in writing her stories, is showing her where she saved herself throughout the story. And so in her 70s, she became a celebrity. And here's just a few pictures of some of the things that we did. So Margaret's story was made into a musical production. And there's a picture, I've got one coming up as well. She got to go see the musical production staged, going back to visit the boat, the North Star, which is at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. For anybody tuning in from Canada, you'll know Beachcombers was a huge show back in the day. So Molly's Reach was one of the places there. We went there, Peggy's Cove, Ottawa. She went to Havana as a guest of the Canadian and Cuban governments on CBC, a lot of things. And here's when she got to go see in Ottawa, she saw her story staged on a stage. Really, really exciting. And she just never believed. She said, I was just a retired farm wife. Like I thought I was just going to look after grandkids and live my life out. And she traveled the world, sharing her story and inspiring other people when she claimed her story. We don't all have trauma in our lives, but we've all had something that we had to overcome. And when you make really good friends with that story of what you've overcome, you become really powerful. So usually I don't share what happened to the stockings, but I brought Margaret with me. And if the sound doesn't work, Mona, please just let me know. I think it's clicked on to share though. And I'll let her tell you what she did with the stockings.
My classmates, they were all excited and they said, guess what? We're getting new stockings. And so the ones I had were always falling down. And I was so happy that I was going to get a new pair. And she handed everyone their stockings. When it came to me, I had my eyes closed and I opened them. She had a pair of red stockings in her hands. And I looked at her and I said, but they're red. And she had that wicked smile on her face. When I went to they call it the refectory. It's a place where you went to eat your lunch and meals. And girls started calling me Fatty Legs. And I was just horrified because one other little girl said, she was laughing and she said, ha ha, Fatty Legs. And I told her, fatty face. And then I said, well, come with me and you can't get along with the other children. I got a job for you. So went to the laundry house and they had a big vat of laundry. And she said, I have to look after that. keep the fire going. I was crying, and I heard my tear going. Psst. I took them off right away, and I threw them in with the firewood, and that was that. I was very happy. And then when I got back to the school, the raven said, "Where are your red stockings?" So I burned them, and I got rid of my red stockings. But she got the children to find them, to look for them, and I knew they couldn't find them because I know what I did with them. They were gone. My class.
So that was very much Margaret's personality. She's like, they're gone. Yeah, being able to claim that. So I'll just show just a few minutes of this. This is the musical that she got to go and see. Some of you might recognize the woman who played Margaret, Serene Carson Fox. She is a model for Sephora, for Nike's Indigenous line. She's a TV show host and actress. She's done a lot of cool things. So I'll just play this just for a couple seconds here.
When I was a young girl, outsiders came flitting about the north.
They plucked us from our homes on the scattered islands of the Arctic Ocean, back to nests they called schools in Aklavik. 3 times I had made the journey to Aklavik with my father, across the open ocean to buy supplies. I was mesmerized by the spectacle of the strange dark-cloaked nuns and the pale-skinned priests who traveled across different oceans from far-off lands.
So I'll stop there. So that was just a small piece of the musical production. It's been staged on three different runs, and the really special thing about that is there was a narrator. There's been 2 different narrators, but both intergenerational survivors of residential school who were able to heal a lot from that, and then also Serene. Her father and a number of her family members went to residential school. So not just did Margaret get to heal through sharing her story, but she also got to bring a lot of other people along for that journey.
Christy, thank you so much. I had a smile on my face throughout the presentation, and I was thinking that this is very powerful because you turned something which is a trauma, and you shared the story in a way that it was really inspiring to watch. So tell me, we have a couple of questions, and I know it's been an hour. We do have a couple of questions, but I just wanted to ask you personally the power of this story sharing and storytelling and sharing the story. And what is the results that you have been looking for? Did you get that result? And if yes, what went beyond that?
Oh yeah. So in a lot of ways, so as I said, Margaret brought other people along for the journey. One of the people being me. So having been raised by a stepfather who went to residential school, and I grew up in a community where everybody's parents pretty much went to residential school. There was a lot of people who went, and because of that trauma, unresolved trauma, a lot of alcoholism and different things like that. So I didn't grow up in the best situation. But I always had this sense something really bad had happened because all these people were so hurt. And we weren't learning about residential school when I was in school, though I did have one teacher who showed us a movie called Where the Spirit Lives. And so after watching that, some of us were like, well, maybe that's what happened to our parents. Maybe that's why they are the way they are. And I got really curious and wanted to know more, but there wasn't really any information out there. So I was walking around sort of with this hole in me. When you're parented by somebody who was parented in a really, well, not parented at all, didn't have a parent, but grew up in a really abusive situation, it impacts you. So I always felt like my stepfather hated me and that he didn't love me. And then after learning more about residential school, I learned that a lot of things he did, he really just thought that's how you parented. It didn't have anything to do with him hating me at all. So that helped me with a lot of healing. Also from like more the institutional side of things. So when I was 17, I joined the Canadian Infantry. Women in the infantry were really new. So I got picked on is probably a very mild word, quite a lot. And there was a lot of unresolved stuff that I hadn't healed from. And through talking with Margaret and how she survived, I was able to start seeing myself more as a hero and not a victim. Not a hero of anybody other than myself, really. But I was, and then now the students I work with, sometimes I have students who've been to residential school. Most of my students, either their parents or their grandparents went to residential school, or I mostly teach Indigenous cohorts, but sometimes new Canadians as well. And a lot of people who have come to Canada because of different circumstances that have a lot of trauma. And having Margaret be so patient with me walking through that journey, I'm able to walk through that journey now with a lot of other people and help them start on their healing journey and finding their own empowerment.
For sure. And the story that you shared and everything you shared about Margaret, it has a lot of wisdom. And I believe that our entire Indigenous community, they have a wisdom that one of the questions that we have is, how can we connect to that wisdom again? Or are there any, different classes or workshops, or like, how can we learn more about that wisdom and that culture?
Oh yeah, so there is a lot still being shared, and one of the best ways is to open up a book. There are so many brilliant authors. One that comes to mind is Sri Damaline, who wrote The Marrow Thieves, and its follow-up Hunting by Stars. And it is sort of in this world where the society as we know it has crumbled and fallen apart. And she says, I love how she says it, is that basically that like these characters are having an Indigenous story about getting through that. Why wouldn't it be Indigenous people surviving that and making it through? Because for Indigenous people, they don't call anything, when they write literature like this, they don't call it post-apocalyptic, because the Indigenous people have been living the apocalypse since 1492. But because they've been living in this dystopian world for them for so long, that they have a lot of wisdom. Moon of the Crusted Snow is another book that takes place that's after the collapse of society as we know it. But books is a great gateway. There are some great podcasts out there, just searching around and finding out who the sort of like legitimate Indigenous voices are. But there's so much art. A great show to watch. It's kind of a comedy, and it takes place under some not ideal circumstances, but Reservation Dogs. It's available on Disney Plus, but just a brilliant show about these young people going through some pretty tumultuous times. But I would say immerse in art. There's so much art out there. You can of course also take courses if you live in an area that's in Canada or the US. You could probably find ways to connect in as well. Most communities have a friendship center. That's a great place to start connecting in with Indigenous communities, and just watching for what events go on. Universities often have guest speakers. Most literary festivals will have, most of them have gone online now, and they always have Indigenous authors speaking about things. So.
Fantastic, Christy. Thank you so much. One of the questions that we have is actually about the US as well. That was it the same situation in the US and Canada, or was it different?
Yeah, so the US had actually, they call them boarding schools, the same thing, the Indian boarding schools, same circumstances. The first one was Carlisle, and it was an industrial school. So basically teaching children to do jobs that nobody wanted to do. A long time ago online, they were pretty old, probably not with us anymore. I had met some elders who were getting DNA testing done because they were taken from, so here in Canada, we have reserves, and in the States it's called a reservation. But some elders who had been taken from their reserves and home territories when they were really young and sent to residential school and Indian boarding school and never went home again. And they weren't even sure where they came from. So they were trying to find out where they came from so that they could go home to die. So we also had the 60 scoop, which a lot of people consider it's gone on way longer than the 60s. It still exists today, which is another form of assimilation. So where they take children from Indigenous families and adopt them out predominantly to white families. And up until not that long ago, a lot of children were also adopted out overseas to all over the place. The United States, Buffy St. Marie was somebody who was taken under this process and adopted out to Boston is where she ended up. She's from Saskatchewan. So that's still quite a big problem as well, that if you're Indigenous, you're much more likely to lose your child, and sometimes for no reason at all. Yeah, so, and that happens in the States as well.
Okay. One of the question is, did parents know which residential school their children are at?
Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't really know. Some people who were taken from the area that I live in, and even quite a bit further north, were taken down to near Vancouver to residential schools there. And even if those parents had been told where it was, a lot of times they didn't really have a concept of where that was, how far away it was. Margaret's father and mother knew where she was at because they took her to the school. But a lot of times they didn't necessarily know, especially in the earlier days, they didn't necessarily know. Sometimes when they did know, parents would show up there, they try and get their children back. They would be told that their children weren't there, or sometimes the parents would miss the children so much, they would set up their camps, like basically in the front yard or just in front of the school, just to be near their children.
Fantastic. One of the questions is, what is the best way to honor the tradition and to teach our kids about it? So I know you have workshops for children as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the other ways that especially people who live in Canada and the US to honor the tradition, and they teach their kids as well about it?
I think one of the very biggest things that I'm always big on when I speak to schools is, so now that Canada is finding out about, and the US, about these schools and what happened, which really, so Margaret kept her secret for 65 years, but Canada kept their secret for 100 years. It was really 2010, happened to be the same year that the book came out, 2010, that they started talking about residential schools. But so now we have this whole flood of, I call it, for lack of a better word, trauma porn, where people get really excited to hear about all the horrible things that happened. It's same with the Holocaust. Sometimes people want to read books about the really gruesome stuff. But when you're talking with your children, the best thing you can do is find materials where they show how the child in some way saved themselves. Because what happens is even if the settlers were really bad and they did all the horrible things, if the Indigenous people are always shown as losing, those are still stories of supremacy. It's still saying the settlers were more powerful and more advanced. So looking at stories where the children do something heroic, or even looking at stories that have nothing at all to do with any kind of trauma, it's just children and people living their lives, but through an Indigenous lens. I think it's really important to balance that. Also recognizing that Indigenous people are still here, finding out whose territory you're on, because different cultures have really, really different teachings. Trying to show up to things like, in Canada, we have Orange Shirt Day, which is to commemorate the residential school survivors. So showing up to those things. We're in a pandemic world right now, but there's usually things online happening. The solstice, there's always Indigenous Peoples Day. There's always something going on for the solstice, either online, or you can go see free concerts in parks and all sorts of things like that. So just kind of being aware and normalizing interacting with Indigenous culture. I think instead of this, we put this like mystical, like beads and feathers, but when it's more normalized, there's less othering and more cooperation going on. So that answers that question.
Absolutely, Christy. And that is the reason I had a smile on my face, because even though it was such a traumatic situation, you showed us the strength of Margaret and how she managed to handle it, and how she turned something which was negative in her life into something which was very, very inspiring. She educated so many people. And I love when you said she owned this story and she became the hero of it, which was, I believe, the main thing that we wanted to talk about today as well. So thank you so much, Christy. This was such an awesome session. I learned a lot personally. And as I said, I believe it's our responsibility to educate ourselves. And it's truly a blessing to have people like yourself who give us your time to tell us about what happened and also how to take it forward. So it's not just about the past, but how to move forward as well, and make sure that we honor all of these traditions and the beauty and the wisdom that this culture has. Any final words for our community?
Oh, that just to not be scared to unearth your own stories and claim those. That was one of the coolest things that I seen with Margaret sharing her story, is having children who grew up in refugee camps then speaking about their experiences and opening up and claiming those, or even settlers who went to Catholic schools who had bad experiences. I don't know, just people from all over the world that started sharing their stories. The other thing that happens, so the selfish thing is that you get to empower yourself, but the non-selfish thing is you open up for connection with other people when you share your stories. And it's kind of infectious when you start reclaiming yourself. You might share a story that there's parallels with somebody else with their story and they haven't been able to share it yet, but they benefit from your healing. One of my elders says that healing people help other people heal, and not even with trying, just people who are working on their own healing help other people heal.
Fantastic. It gives them permission also to own their story, and there's so much wisdom to learn from this. So again, Christy, thank you so much. I really appreciate you and everything that you do. And hopefully maybe in the future we can have another session together, because this is such an interesting topic that I believe there are hours and hours that we can talk about it. So thank you again, and bye everyone for now.
Thank you.